All right, welcome back. For this portion of our afternoon until we leave to go to the floor, we have a couple of witnesses here, advocates who can sort of give a perspective of why this bill is important and why it's coming forward again. And so we have Michelle Fay, who's in the chair right now from Voices for Vermont's Children, and then we'll definitely hear from Kara Casey, Director of Economic Development for Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, and perhaps we'll hear from Carrie Brown, who is the ED of the Vermont Commission on Women. But Michelle, you've, I believe, been in the room while we've introduced ourselves, so we won't do that, but we'll dispense with that and just pass the microphone to you. So if you could just introduce yourself and let us know why Voices is supporting this bill, that would be great.
Great. Thank you. For the record, Michelle Fay with Voices for Vermont's Children. And I was kind of bummed that the chair took my Groundhog Day joke away from me. I had it all queued up. But because for some of you, this is, maybe just for a couple of you, this is maybe my third time giving some version of this testimony. But luckily for many of you, it's the first time. So I am here wearing a couple of hats. I'm here as the Executive Director of Voices for Vermont's Children. And we are an organization that works to advance policies that improve the lives of children and youth, with a particular emphasis on improving equity in our economy and our institutions in order to ensure that every Vermont child has what they need to thrive. I'm also here today in my coordination role with the Vermont Paid Family and Medical Leave Coalition. The testimony that I sent to Ron includes a slide deck and also kind of a written testimony that's kind of the back end of the slide deck, but I didn't know, it's not all that fun to stare at words up on the screen, so I don't know what's going to be up there, but I'll try to coordinate it as I go through. So our coalition includes a diverse group of organizations that are advocacy groups for different identity and constituencies across the state, as well as business leaders. And you'll probably be hearing from other members of the coalition. Kara Casey's one, for example, and Carrie Brown. But I'm going to provide just an overview about our policy goals, as well as some specific points relating to children and families in my Voices role. So it's going to be a little fluid. So what do we say what do we mean when we say we want a strong bill? Based on the experiences of states that have had paid leave programs in place and related research, experts have identified several essential elements that ensure that those who need access to paid leave the most will have it when they need it. To achieve health and economic policy goals, paid leave programs should contain these elements. The first is that they're universal. An all-in model ensures that everyone has access, and eligibility is tied to your overall participation in the workforce rather than tied to your relationship with a particular employer. Opt-in or voluntary programs risk problems impacting both the cost and sustainability of the program and the likelihood that workers will have that access when they need it. Some of the specific concerns around non-universal programs are this concept of adverse selection that we see in the healthcare field or health insurance market, where people who know that they're going to need to be heavy utilizers of the insurance are the ones who will enroll. That drives up costs and actually jeopardizes the sustainability of the program or the affordability of the program. There's also research, and I have some hot links on the Word version of the testimony that you can click on to see what I'm talking about, on some long-term disability insurance that found that many workers underestimate the likelihood that they will need it. And so they don't enroll in the program, and then they have a qualifying medical expense or medical event, and then the service isn't there for them. So that's another argument for an all-in model. And then we know that voluntary plans worsen disparities in access. Low-wage workers who are already less likely to have access to any kind of paid leave other than like the mandatory sick days that we have in Vermont will continue to be left out of this benefit. The second essential element is comprehensive coverage. So strong paid leave programs cover all the types of leaves, and I don't need to elaborate them. They're all in age 66. Those are great. 12 weeks is really considered the minimum for parental bonding and recovery from childbirth, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics. And the research could not be clearer about the importance of newborn attachment and bonding with a consistent, loving caregiver. The next essential element is adequate wage replacement. It has to be high enough to ensure that all workers can afford to take the leave they need, including and maybe especially low-income workers who need as much of their income as possible to pay their bills. And I was listening to some of the conversation you were having in committee this morning about, I think it was Representative Parsons who raised the question around wage replacement and how to kind of find that sweet spot. And it's important to note that the program designs that are in place and that are you've seen on the charts that JFO has provided and other national organizations provide very detailed charts of what different states have put in place, that those are a combination or even a collision of evidence-based policy and just political context, right? So there's a trend toward building more inclusive, more equitable programs, but individual states, obviously, just as we will here in Vermont, will contend with the political pressures and come up with a plan that makes the best of both the evidence on hand and also our political context. So there are currently 11 states plus Washington, D.C. that have comprehensive PFML programs. 8 of these provide for progressive wage replacement rates where lower income workers receive a higher percentage of their incomes. I think Joyce Manchester talked about that a bit during her testimony. The California lesson, we looked at California a lot because in spite of the fact that people talk about Rhode Island being the first, California was actually the first to have a comprehensive paid leave program. They've had family medical leave for 20 years, whereas Rhode Island only added the family leave component, I think, in 2013 or something like that. So California is really providing us with a ton of data, and they are already learning from the experience of their own programs. So they started out with fairly low wage replacement. They then shifted to, which was I think 55% was the ceiling of their wage replacement. They moved that up to 60 to 70%. And then after their leave taking data continued to show that low wage replacement levels were the primary barrier for low income workers, they just shifted the top end of the scale up to 90%. That just happened this past year. So that's, I think, an example of how we don't have to recreate the wheel. There's a bunch of other states that have made the mistakes before us, and we can learn from their experience. Inclusive family definition, we love it. It's great what's in this bill. Colorado definitely moved the ball down the field in a way that's really helpful and reflects the modern workforce. Job protection, not my area of expertise, but it seems like it's handled well in this bill. And then maybe one of the more controversial topics is the public administration, accountable public administration. So there is evidence that privatization of public goods has been shown to worsen inequities. A strong paid leave program should be administered by the state so that it's accountable to Vermonters. Plus, it keeps the profit motive out of the equation. And to that end, I did submit another chart. Oh, there's nothing up there. Okay. Keep thinking there's something happening behind me. I did submit a chart that is our attempt to do a side-by-side of these essential elements and then the proposals or the plans that are kind of being considered. So there's the governor's plan, the administration's plan, as well as this bill. And when we see what the Senate offers, we'll plug that in there as well. Okay, so now I'm kind of shifting into more of my voices hat for a bit and just wanted to provide you with what the landscape is in Vermont for working families. So 76.1% of kids under 6 have all available parents in the workforce. That number rises to over 80% of kids when we talk about ages 6 to 17. So job security and consistent work-related income really matters to kids and families, and the overwhelming majority of parents are working outside the home. I don't know if you all remember or were ever polled for the Household Pulse survey that the Census Bureau conducted, and maybe they still are, I'm not really sure, but during the pandemic, they started doing these polls to find out how families were faring and different kind of indicators around family well-being and economic security. And over the course of 2022, when they asked households with children if they were having difficulty paying for usual household expenses in the week prior to the survey being asked, the answers ranged from 30 to 46% of households saying, yes, we're having trouble paying our bills. So this is the context that we are now operating in and thinking about creating an equitable, robust paid leave program. And in previous years, we've had public hearings where people come and pack their really heart-wrenching stories into a 2-minute presentation. I don't know that that's in the plans for this year, but we would hear from people who would tell their stories of making it work. And often those stories, so they were about experiencing a serious illness or welcoming a new child without access to paid leave. They'd be back into a corner with no choices. This is not an option for them. Like, they have to not be working. And they were forced to take steps that undermined their family's economic security. There's an amazing amount of survey data that comes from leave-taking behaviors under FMLA. And in 2012, there was a survey that kind of dug into it a little bit. And that data really backs up the experiences of the families that we hear from, that leave takers without access to paid leave overwhelmingly reported that making ends meet was difficult. Most limited their spending to bare necessities. Many drew down or depleted their savings. More than a third put off paying bills, so fell behind. About 30% borrowed money, went into debt. 15% signed up for public assistance. Even those families who are technically able to arrange paid leave by mashing together their accrued paid time off or vacation time, then they come to the end of, especially thinking about parents, they come to the end of their leave and they're left with no cushion for when their baby or child inevitably gets sick, or when their older child has a childcare closure, or any number of things. So there's no buffer. I've provided a couple slides that talk about the health and well-being impacts. There's just tons and tons of data that could be a whole big presentation. I don't know how much convincing you all need about the fact that paid leave is very good for children. There's tons of data that demonstrate really specific things, like access to leave cuts infant mortality by 10%. That's just huge. Kids are more likely to be fully vaccinated if their parents have access to paid leave in that first year, get their regular checkups. There's fewer low birth weight babies and preterm births when there's access to paid leave. And all those things have financial implications as well, right? So according to the modeling study that was from 2016, but there's still a lot of really useful information in there, Vermont would experience savings due to the increased number of newborns that were born at normal birth weight and on time. And so there's costs associated with that. It's been shown conclusively that there are better mental health outcomes for birthing parents, and babies experience less stress when they're allowed to bond during that 12-week period. There's also information that shows that when partners are able to share caregiving duties, and Carrie will probably talk more about the gender equity implications of paid leave, but it's linked to reduced divorce rates, higher cognitive development or improved cognitive development, and educational performance for kids. There's just a plethora of good outcomes. Okay, I'm going to skip past that. And then paid leave economic. So there's a few other economic issues, and one of our underlying goals at Voices for Vermont's Children is establishing family economic security. So supporting parents in their dual roles as employees and caregivers yields economic benefits. Evidence from states with universal PFML shows that these programs improve workforce attachment and support economic independence, with the greatest effects seen among the most disadvantaged families. So these programs, if they're designed well, target the people who need them the most. Welcoming a new child to the family, recovering from a serious illness or injury, or supporting the recovery of a loved one. These are watershed moments that can set families on a path toward a healthy, secure future, or turn them toward damaging hardship. And the impacts of spending childhood in poverty are devastating both to children and to communities. Children raised in poverty experience poor health outcomes in relation to their non-poor peers. They are twice as likely to repeat a grade or be expelled, and more than twice as likely to drop out of high school. Girls raised in poverty are more than 3 times as likely to have a child as a teen. And poor children are 10 times as likely to have experienced food insecurity, and hunger in the past year. So according again to that 2016 feasibility study, an estimated between like 1,100 and 3,200 households, workers and their families would be prevented from falling into poverty by the accessibility of this program. The next slide, I wanted to say something about like what social insurance is, what its purpose is. And it came from listening to JFO's presentation yesterday. There's a couple things. So one, you'll hear sometimes people say, we don't want to add any additional burdens to Vermont families. And my reaction to that is that is a perception that is rooted in a very privileged position in life, because the reality is the absence of a universal equitable program is expensive, and that those costs right now are being borne by individual workers and their families in ways that can be devastating. So the purpose of a social insurance program is to recognize that families and individual workers being able to take care and prioritize their health and the health of their families is good for all of us, and it benefits us all to pay into it, and not to think of it as, well, I'm paying in more than I'm getting back, because it's kind of like, I think when I move on to the next point, I talk about, we don't think about how much of our taxes goes to road maintenance, and is my road actually costing as much? It's that kind of thing. We don't parse public goods in that way for other things that we all chip in for. And so this is a social benefit that we strongly believe should be shared across the workforce. So given that, JFO staff reported that with the wage cap being at 2 times the Social Security base rate, that captures 96.3% of wages. I guess for me, it begs the question, why have a cap at all? It's such a tiny amount left. Feels like it would simplify administration. I'm not really sure, but just kind of acknowledge that we want a progressive program. We want people who can afford to pay for this program to do so. Let's see. The other question that I wanted to raise is I came across a research paper that I've linked for you about asking questions about whether opting out for for companies that are offering a private plan could create problems for the public program. There's a research paper that raises questions about the impact on the viability of the public program that could have. And at the very least, I think in going through the bill, there was a sense that I think maybe Representative Bartley, you raised this of like, how much of this are we leaving to discretion, and how much of it should we really spell out? Like, this is what an equitable or equivalent program needs to contain these elements. And so we would really push for that. And the last thing I wanted to say is that we ran the draft by some national partners, and one of them just suggested, this is really kind of a flag, maybe more for Ways and Means or for Damien, but that the bill language could be a little bit more explicit in making clear that people who aren't currently working, but who meet the qualification of having earned wages in 2 of the previous 4 quarters can apply for the program. So if you're on unemployment and you experience a qualifying leave event that prevents you from job searching, and so therefore makes you ineligible for unemployment, we'd want you to be able to access the paid leave program if you qualify based on your previous earnings, if that makes sense. So that's what I have to say. Are there any questions?
I don't think right now. I've been scrolling through the information that's on the website, and I would suggest that we all just take a look at it. It does have some of the facts and figures, but also just it also explains who's in the network or the
Coalition, yeah.
The coalition, and you provided quite a bit of good information, just straightforward stuff that supports what you're saying here. But I think if anyone has a comment or a question for Michelle. No, seeing none, then we'll move to Kara. But and I'm sure you'll be here once or twice along the way.
Yeah, camping out
in our rear view mirror.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Next up, we have Kara Casey. Kara, welcome back. Good to see you.
Hi, thanks so much. Can you all hear me?
We can. There you go. Yep.
Awesome.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today in support of H66. For the record, my name is Kara Casey. I am the Director of Economic Empowerment at the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. As Michelle mentioned, the Vermont Network has been a member of the Paid Family and Medical Leave Coalition for many years, advocating for a strong paid family and medical leave program. And we are especially excited to see the safe leave provisions in this year's bill. And we feel that the version of H66 that is in front of you is a very strong bill. We're in full support of this piece and as well as the safe leave provisions. So I'm going to briefly speak to the impact of family and medical leave on survivors of violence, but the bulk of my testimony will be focused on the safe leave piece. The Vermont Network's mission is to uproot the causes of violence and build a world free of oppression, where actions, beliefs, and systems support all people to thrive. Supporting programs that create economic security for workers is one way that we can build that world. We know that approximately 99% of survivors of domestic violence have experienced economic abuse as a part of that cycle of power and control. This has significant impacts on a survivor's ability to gain and maintain employment, to save, build credit, etc. The CDC found that individual victims of sexual violence incur over $120,000 over a lifetime, which includes costs associated with lost wages. Access to resources that increase economic stability are essential to a survivor in being able to rebuild life after experiencing abuse. After leaving an abusive relationship, a survivor is often left as a sole provider for their family. Studies show that children's resiliency is increased when mothers are full-time employed. That is, gainful employment has a positive influence on their children's recovery from witnessing domestic violence. So if a mother is able to care for a new baby, ill family member, or herself without losing out on income and without having to leave a job, it can improve overall long-term outcomes for her children. And now I will talk to you a little bit about the safe leave piece. I would first like to say that having this leave in addition to paid family and medical leave would allow survivors of domestic violence, sexual violence, and stalking to be able to really use leave in a way that they need without having to make choices between, let's say, taking time off to care for their new baby or taking time off to access, counseling support for themselves after experiencing violence. So we are in support of the qualified uses of the leave on pages 44 and 45. It is broad and encompasses the many reasons that we see survivors and their families needing to take time off of work as a result of violence. Survivors deserve to be able to take time off to heal, seek support and safety for themselves and their children without fear of losing income if they have that access to accrued paid leave, and without fear of losing their employment. This bill would improve a survivor's access to safety planning, mental health resources, medical care, and if they choose the criminal legal system. And I feel like giving real life examples of how leave is used is compelling and important. So I'm going to share some examples of the impacts of these pieces. So in my position here at the network, I often support advocates who are working with survivors to gain safe housing. when a survivor is moving from an unsafe housing situation, the process is not as simple as just finding new housing. And your committee knows that finding new housing in and of itself is really difficult. Many times survivors work with advocates, community partners, family members to come up with a safety plan of when is the safest time to leave, what needs to be in place, what resources do they have. Questions like, do I need to leave town? Like, do I need to relocate? This bill would allow survivors to take time off to safety plan and to relocate or secure safe housing without potentially losing out on income, without risking their employment, which would make it harder for them to be able to have those funds to be able to gain that new housing. The Vermont Network houses the Vermont Forensic Nursing Program. The SANE nurses, which are sexual assault nurse examiners, have countless examples of survivors not getting the emergency medical care that they need when they come to the ER after a sexual assault. The SANE exam process can be long, and people opt out regularly so they won't miss work. So patients will come to the hospital for emergent care needs after an experience of violence, but only end up getting some or maybe none of what can be offered, which comes with which is free and comes with wraparound supports, often because their jobs take priority and the process takes too much time. And I'm told that this exact scenario is actually built into some of the advocacy training that's done around this program because it comes up so often. And then I was recently told a story of a survivor who missed 5 days of work to prepare for and attend relief from abuse extension hearings and depositions. Each one of these depositions and hearings were canceled on the day for various reasons outside of the survivor's control. So that means that this worker had to ask for the time off and then go back and ask for additional time off. This does not account for all the hours that were missed in order to complete forensic interviews, meet with a state's attorney, move to an undisclosed location, and work with her advocate on safety planning over the course of the year. So in addition to the economic instability created by needing to leave her home, missing out on work has created financial hardship that we often see has really long-term effects for survivors of violence. I wanted to address the required documentation piece on page 46. We support the use of may, as in may require an employee to provide documentation, and we support keeping it at one, so one of the following sources, as well as the ability for the survivor to self-certify and the confidentiality piece, which are consistent with best practices and with state and federal laws. I did hear a question around the self-certification, and there is a self-certification in VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act housing protections. And so back several years ago when we created some housing protections, we put that language in, and this mirrors that language. So it's similar to what's provided in federal law and what is in state law in different places. And we would propose one change to this section, and I did include it in my written testimony. I would ask that this section be changed to say an employer may require an employee to provide documentation of the need for the leave, period. An employee may provide one of the following. And the concern that I had about the language that was in there was, for example, if I went to my employer and I said, you know, I'm experiencing stalking and I would like to take some time off to be able to safety plan with my advocate. The way that it was written, the employer could choose which type of documentation they needed. So they could, for example, say, okay, I would need for you to provide me a court document. And as I heard you all mention, I may not have a court document. I may not have chosen to go down that route. Or they could say, I would need some medical information from your doctor that says that, you have experienced this. So we would prefer that the language say that the employer may ask for what, here's a list of documentation, please provide me with one of these, and that the survivor be able to choose which one that they provide. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you so much for your thoughtful work on this bill. If passed, I know that it will inevitably be have immense impact on the folks that are living in Vermont that have experienced domestic violence, sexual violence, and stalking. Thank you.
Any questions for Kara right now, Representative Krasnow?
Hi, thank you so thank you so much for your work. Yeah, so I'm glad that you brought some of those things up. My concern is I'm hoping that it's very difficult sometimes for folks and survivors to go to their employers or folks they work with to discuss these things. And I was curious if you had any suggestions on, I guess this could go further, but how we could let folks know that this is available, that this is part of it, that it's not just for the things people often think are included in a paid family leave, medical leave, just so that they can feel supported if they need to come to their employers with that.
Yeah, and you brought up something really important, which is that even if this bill is passed, there are going to be people that just do not feel comfortable coming forward with this information to their employer, and that is their choice. Right. And I think that as the network, we can definitely commit to getting information out if this bill is passed about safe leave, to make sure that the advocates and the other community partners that we work with are aware that it is available. When we've passed other leaves or other bills specifically to survivors, we have done, some public campaigns around raising awareness, and we would commit to doing that as well.
Thank you.
Any further questions for Kara or comments? Thank you for bringing this forward. It's a little late for us and we're a little tired, but I just want to acknowledge also that any kind of testimony, I mean, we were talking today about viewing things through an equity lens, questions through an equity lens. And, I have to say, I have no idea what it's like to be in a situation that would require this kind of leave or this kind of care that the network and others provide. And it's really, it sounds, testimony like this, and this is not a criticism at all, it is part of your work, it almost sanitizes the pain and the emotion, because the nature of trying to experience or to ask someone with lived experience what this is like, and how we know how traumatic that is. And we appreciate that it has to be this conversation has to be this way, but I don't think it does it justice without acknowledging the depth of the issues for individuals who are involved in intimate partner violence, whether it's the violence itself or the culture of reporting this to your employer or going to court or going to a doctor. Part of our work is to try to appreciate that and to provide a tool, not the tool, but a tool that would help their lives go better. And so I just want to acknowledge that, because it's difficult to, sometimes in our job, it's difficult to balance between just the facts and just the realities. So thank you for bringing this forward and working with the other sponsors in particular and the writers to include this proposal.
Thank you.
All right, committee, I think we're not going to go off yet. Thank you, Kara. Thank you, Michelle. And we'll see you here in about. And Carrie Brown, we'll see you soon. Feel better, please. Yeah. So committee, we'll finish that for right now because we're going to be on the floor for a little while. But I do want to say that we are almost more than tentatively, but less than solidly scheduled to have a public hearing on February 16th, so 2 weeks from today, on housing issues. The Senate invited us to participate in a planning session to hear from anyone who signs up over the course of a couple hours for 3-minute sessions to just share stories about their housing or have questions about housing, whether it's about rental housing, fair housing, affordable housing, or affordable home ownership, or what have you. The Senate is working on an omnibus housing bill that we'll see when it gets through the Senate, will come over here. But that'll be February 16th. It'll start at 5 o'clock. It'll be in the Pavilion Building in room 267, and it'll be a hybrid meeting. So we don't know how to expect how many people might come to a housing open meeting, but that said, it'll be hybrid, so there'll be people that will have the opportunity to testify via,
Most of the hearings I've been to have been very pro or con. Second Amendment rights, reproductive rights, and the chamber's packed. I don't think anybody's opposed to housing. It's just different perspectives on it. We were talking about how many people in it. 5, 30, 70?
Hundreds.
So with the space that the General Assembly has access to on the second floor of the Pavilion Building, we've all been in meetings there. We'll have the meeting there. We'll have it. If there's a lot of people, we'll do overflow in a couple of different spaces within that. And so just mark that on your calendar. It's a Thursday night. It won't go later than a couple of hours. If you see a press release on it anywhere, we don't put an end time, just in case only 5 people show up. If we say we're going to be there until 7, you have to be there till 7. So in case somebody shows up at 5:00. But we are, I think everybody has to have the ability to experience a public hearing. Granted, it's not going to be in the chamber. It's not going to be, as big as some others. It's a listening session for us to hear from the public. So mark that on your calendars. I'm sure we'll remind you once or twice about that. We'll make sure that our work that day ends early enough so that people can get a break. I know it's a floor day, but I don't know what would be on the floor, but we'll make sure that it's that we balance off the work day with rest time. Yep.
No, I really appreciate that because I have had many folks in my community ask how they can get in front of everyone and not just keep sending emails. So that's great.
So I think we can go offline.
Grab.